Yeah, no problem. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for dialing in. We will be recording the session. I think my colleague Maria has just mentioned in the chat, we will be recording the session and we are recording now. However, we will be pausing and stopping the recording at the Q&A. So after the two presentations, the recording will stop so that the Q&A is able to happen under Chatham House rules. And so this morning we are in for a real treat. We obviously have Gareth Harrison on the call, who's going to be hopefully navigating and showing us the way in some pretty tricky and uncharted economic waters. So it'll be wonderful to hear from him. But before that, we have a real treat in store. We've got Michael Pratt, who is the CEO of Invite Homes, a Kiwi up in Scotland. And he was recently on an incredible life-changing trip. And we wanted to share a few thoughts, some pearls of wisdom, and some fantastic imagery, because I think a lot of it was kind of depicting the situation of the SMEs at the moment. So there were some really nice parallels drawn. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael.
Thanks very much, Anna. I'll keep this brief, but I wanted to be a bit light-hearted after what I think is going to be, well, hopefully not too much doom and gloom, Gareth, but we'll start off a bit later. So is this, I'm just checking, have you got that screen come up now?
Yes, we have. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. So you'll may be aware that Edwin, Justin Gilbert, and Jason Sobey and myself were over in Africa a short while ago. The reason for that was that I believe about 5 years ago, Edwin had asked Jason, who's the South African amongst us, and the R&B Forum, about potentially doing an African safari to celebrate his 70th. Now, that was about 5 years ago, and it's taken that long to get four people together that were going to spend 10 days with Edwin. It's been a real challenge. So we finally got it all kicked off, and I wanted to plug Dan from Tuscan Trails first, because it's safe to say, Edwin, that this has probably been one of the most well-organised trips I've ever been on with yourself. 10 days, everything to military precision, never having a spare moment to kick back. We had so many amazing things to see. So Dan, thank you so much for organising everything that you did. It was absolutely amazing. We'll never forget it. It was once in a lifetime. So this is the motley crew here. We started off our trip in Botswana, which was the Chobe Game Lodge, one of the biggest in Africa, renowned for its elephants, but so many different animals we came across on the safari. We had our two guides there, Joy on the left and the other Kemi that was on the right there next to Jason. Absolutely fantastic. I think she spent 22 years in the lodge there, so she knows her stuff. Just a sample of the things that we saw when we're out on our safaris each day, up at the crack of dawn, going out to see what we could see at dawn, right through to lunchtime each day. So we spent quite a bit of time in these four-wheel drive safari wagons, but these photos were taken from my phone, so we were within meters of some of these animals. It was just absolutely, truly inspiring and amazing. And I've only given you a small selection of some of the photos that we took there. It took thousands, but there was never any shortage of things to take photos of there. All of their wildlife there, so close to the vehicle. This is us having a wee rest stop at one point. Now, the reason I point this picture out with Edwin, because there's some things in life that can't be explained, and one of them was Edwin's propensity for tucking his trousers into his socks. It was commented on by quite a few of the safari tour guides, some of the locals. No one wanted to be standing next to Edwin for his photo because of this strange phenomenon. So he was pictured here quickly taking his socks out from over the top of his trousers before we took our group photo. And one of the things that's a really strange one for me is that on a four-wheel drive safari, amazing footage, amazing things to see. We were warned ahead of time that it might be a little bit rough and ready. You might have to take a few passes on some of your luxuries that you're normally used to, but not Edwin. He managed to secure a pedicure on day 2 of our safari. So I'm sorry for sharing that image with you. And then one of the other things that's quite strange, when you spend a lot of time with someone on safari, you get to know things about them you didn't know or didn't want to know. And we all realised very quickly that Edwin's part of an elite group of people called the SAS. There's only one person in the world part of this group. It's Edwin. It's called the Socks and Sandals Club. And you'll see in the background there that we've got a lady there that didn't even want to have her photo taken with him. It was a source of constant embarrassment. And there'll be lots of photos that I could share with you of Edwin standing by himself, because it was a strange phenomenon that no one wanted to be photographed with. This was us when we came back from Botswana. We did a zip line across the Zambezi at the Victoria Falls Bridge. It was a fantastic event to do. We were meant to be doing a bungee, but I think there was a few expletives thrown about there, and it ended up being just a zip line. I think we're all glad of that. And then towards the end of our trip, we got a bit of tiger fishing out on the Zambezi. I think by this stage, Justin had spent quite a few days and sharing a room with Edwin, so he was starting to look up these fish. he was quite fond of this tiger fish there. I think we all had a coping mechanisms after spending so much time with Edwin. And yet again, we've got a picture there of Edwin sitting there proudly holding his fishing rod, but wearing his socks over the top of his trousers and wearing his golf shoes of all things when we're out fishing. And then we all had a coping mechanism. So on the last day of our trip, we had a whole bottle of rum between the 3 of us or 4 of us to get through. And that picture of Jason and I was the sort of the after effects. I can't actually remember what we saw on that particular fishing trip, but a good way to finish up. And then one of the things I wanted to share with you, which was this sort of analogy, was we were walking across a small pedestrian bridge called Knife Edge Bridge just at the Victoria Falls. And because the Zambezi is in I think it's had the highest rainfall in the last 16 years, so it was in a bit of flood. The falls were spectacular, but it was very glimpsing moments we saw of them because of all the mist that came up off the falls. And when the mist did part for a very few short seconds, I was struck by these 2 trees that were clinging on for dear life on the very precipice of the falls. And I turned to Edwin and I said, this reminds me a little bit of the situation we have at the moment with SME Housebuilders clinging on for dear life. We've got these monstrous forces at work, and it has been for the last 10 years, I think, in the house building sector in the UK. So I stood there looking at these. We took a few photos of them, and I said to Edwin, I think this is probably symbolic of where we are right now with SME Housebuilders and battling the elements, and whether or not they're still there in another few years' time will be interesting to see. And that's pretty much all from me, guys. I just thought I'd share that with you as a bit of light comic relief before we get into Gareth's presentation. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, I don't know whether to thank you, Michael, or not. I mean, my street credibility, clearly, if anyone had any with me, has completely gone. In my defence, before I hand back to you, Anna, I did not take any malaria tablets, and I thought I just didn't want to get bitten. So the reason why I had my socks and was to ensure that I didn't get bitten. So I was completely good and fine. So I'm sure you're all delighted to know that I'm completely healthy on the back of putting my socks in my trousers to ensure that I didn't. So that is my defence. And
it doesn't explain the socks and sandals, Edwin.
So you have your socks over your trousers so you could actually have the mosquitoes run away. Is that the idea? Was it actually to put the mosquitoes off?
It certainly put the locals off, John. There was a wide berth given to them everywhere we went.
Fantastic video. Really, really fantastic.
Anyway,
great analogy. Well done.
The word "wuss" comes to mind, Mike.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bryant. Anyway, it was an incredible trip, and I couldn't have done it with 3 better people that are members of the R&B Forum, the Kiwi, the South African, and Justin Gilbert, the comedian. It was insanely enjoyable. There was one evening where my ribs were in agony and we were on the floor in fits of laughter. I can't remember what it was, but I don't think any of us have laughed so much. So despite that last picture, which I think is very poignant for me to hand over to Anna to introduce our very special guest speaker, it's not something I'm going to organise for the 400 members of the R&B Forum to go over to Africa. I think 3 with me for 7 or whatever days was enough. But what we do have is Jason Sobey was incredible in helping organise it. Dan, who is on the call from Africa, organised an insane trip. And it was just unbelievable. So if anyone has an appetite or is considering, on the R&B Housebuilder Forum website, we're going to put Dan's details because he did an incredible job. He absolutely is passionate about Africa and about the trip. So if anyone is considering venturing there, then by all means, it will be on our forum. You're more than welcome to come make contact. But I'm going to hand back to you, Anna, for the more serious side. I would say serious. Gareth's going to make it positive for us. I know he is. He's going to find some way to encourage us all. So back to you, Anna, to introduce Gareth.
Thank you, Edwin. Well, I don't think he needs much introduction because I think this is the 3rd time that you've graced us with your presentation. So thank you so much for coming back. You always do draw the crowd. We're over 100 people now. And so without further ado, please do start your presentation.
Thanks, Anna. And yeah, thanks. I don't know how to follow that one up. I guess the acid test, Edwin, is have you got your socks tucked into your trousers at home? But we'll not ask you to stand up. We could have an anchorman situation on our hands, which is not where we want to start. So I'm just going to share my slides. Just give me a moment. Let me just, we don't want the IT to stop working at this end. Just want to check, can everyone see that? Has that come up? Yeah, great, excellent. So for those of you that haven't seen me on one of these calls before, I'm Gareth Harrison. I'm one of the bank's agents. I'm actually based up in the northeast. But aside from the day job, which is effectively kind of gathering economic intelligence for the Monetary Policy Committee, the people that set the interest rates, my other job within the agency network is that I am the housing markets expert amongst the agents. So if the MPC have any questions on the housing market, they come to me and I kind of distill all of the intelligence around that. So it's really useful being on this call. I'm interested in the questions that you've got at the end of it, and I'll do my best to kind of navigate a fairly complex economic situation at the moment. And if any of you are interested in speaking to your local agent, feel free to get in touch with Edwin or Anna and we can facilitate that. I know a couple of you have picked up with agents around the country, and we value your intelligence. So let me make a start, hopefully. It's just some headlines. So we had our latest interest rate decision last week. I'm sure you're all aware of where we landed. We kept rates on hold at 3.75%. The vote amongst the MPC, there are 9 MPC members, and it was an 8-1 vote this time. So the 1 was our chief economist, Hugh Pill, who voted to increase rates by 25 basis points to 4%. And I'll try and explain a little bit around the thinking of the committee and Hugh's thinking within that. As to why he voted for an increase. Again, there are some really obvious graphics here, which, unless you've disappeared for the last couple of months, you'll be all too aware of. The war in the Middle East led to energy price rises, and we're going to talk quite a lot about that this morning. Inflation's risen, and we expect it to rise further this year. But whatever happens, we'll make sure that it returns to the 2% target in the medium term. So within the monetary policy report that we released last week, alongside the interest rate decision, we have these reports quarterly, and they're a chance for us to talk about our forecasts and to talk about where the economy is heading, which is what I'm going to do this morning. I should have said at the beginning, by the way, I'll talk for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, and happy to take any questions that you've got at the end. So within the report, we had 2 what we call key policy judgments. The first of which is demand's been weak and the labour market has been loosening for some time now. And we think that that's going to lessen what we call the second round effects from global energy prices. I'm going to explain this in a lot more detail in the slides that we've got coming up. But when it comes to us setting monetary policy, in a nutshell, there's nothing we can do about a war by changing interest rates, obviously, but we do keep very focused on the second round effects of those energy price increases. Those effects are likely to be stronger the larger and more persistent the rise in global energy prices is. Again, we're stating the obvious here, the longer the conflict goes on, the longer the straits are closed, then the stronger the effects are likely to be. So let's start with inflation, and I'll kind of jump on the Victoria Falls analogy that we had at the beginning here. So I didn't speak to the group in February after our February report, but we were kind of on a fairly smooth sailing, dotting along towards inflation, heading back to our 2% target in our in the April reading, which we'll get in a couple of weeks' time, and everything looked like it was going along quite nicely. And then all of a sudden, there's a waterfall on the horizon, and now actually we expect inflation to increase on our central forecast. And I'm going to talk about the different scenarios that we've got further on in the presentation, but we expect inflation now to be around about 3.75% by the end of this year, rather than the 2% that we were forecasting back in February. And that is an entirely energy price story and the secondary effects of the energy price increases that we've had. So the situation has changed. I think it's fair to say, obviously, since the start of March, since the conflict began, and we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like going forward. So that increase in inflation that we've seen has been entirely energy prices. So this graph here kind of shows the composition of the increase that we're expecting over the coming months. The green colour here is prices at the pump, which passed straight through into inflation, basically. We had a sharp increase in petrol prices once the conflict began, which anyone who drives will have noticed all too well. That fed in, well, it fed in March a little bit because the conflict hadn't started right at the beginning of March. In April itself, that adds about 0.6% to the inflation figure. So when we get to the inflation figure for April, because obviously it's backward looking, we'll get that week after next. We expect that to be about 3.5%, and within that, around about 0.6% is pass through from the pumps, direct pass through from the pumps. What we'll see as we go forward is household energy prices will pick up when we get the next Ofgem price cap in July. That's the orange, and you see that that adds to inflation once we get to the beginning of Q3. And we'll also start to see some of the indirect energy impacts, which is the purple, which is largely a food inflation story. So food inflation, obviously it has a large energy component in producing food. There's a lag to that, but we'll start to see that lag pass through by kind of Q3 and onwards. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about food inflation as we go forward. And if we jump back, just to kind of emphasize that we're not in a position now where we expect inflation back to target. It is going to be fairly significantly above target as a result of those energy price increases for the rest of this year. So these curves here, I've become micro-fixated on oil price to the extent that I kind of wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and one of the first things I do is jump on the FT markets data and check where the Brent crude price has gone, much to the annoyance of my wife, who suggests that I should really get a life and stop obsessing over it. So I can tell you that actually this morning oil prices have dipped below $100 a barrel, which is for us good news when it comes to our inflation target. The two graphs that we have here, what they illustrate, and there's a lot going on, there's a lot of dotted lines and what have you, so I'll try and talk about what this is showing. What I wanted to do was give a comparator to the previous energy shock that we had back in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. So on the left we've got oil prices. So if you look at the solid lines here on the two graphs, after Russia invaded Ukraine, oil prices got up to the peak peaked at just under $140 a barrel. So the line here, the graph here shows kind of monthly averages, but they peaked at just under $140 a barrel. This time round, since the start of the Middle East conflict, oil prices have peaked at about 126. We got up to, and as I say, this morning down below $100, which is good news. The dotted lines here are what we call the futures curves, so where the markets expect those prices to go. The dark dashed lines, the thicker dashes, if you like, are where markets expected to go when we produced the April report last week. And the dotted line below that is where they expected it to be in the February report. And as you can see, the futures markets are actually factoring in that oil prices come down fairly significantly and end this year well below $100 a barrel. If we look to the right, that's gas prices, so price per therm. Again, if you look around 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and then you look to the right, we have had a spike since the Middle East conflict began. However, it is nothing like the magnitude that happened when Russia invaded Ukraine, when monthly prices were averaging at around 350 to 400 pence a therm. There was some days within that where the gas price spiked to 700 pence a therm. So many magnitudes higher than we're talking about at the moment. Again, check the prices this morning because I haven't got a life. And gas prices are just above 100 pence per therm at the moment. And again, if you look at those futures curves, the futures curves expect them to come down further over the course of this year. Now, I'm going to talk later in the presentation about 3 scenarios that we've set out, and I might jump back to the futures curves when we're talking about that, because effectively we think there's kind of a more benign case, a central estimate, and I guess a worst case scenario, which would move those futures curves around. But I'll talk about that further on.
Need to go ahead. Was that?
Oh, was that a question or no? I'll go on. What are we okay just to mute ourselves? Because I don't know whether people are asking questions or great. So how do those energy prices play out in services inflation, core goods inflation, and food inflation? I guess the key one is the food inflation chart on the right. So again, the dotted line that you see was where we expected food inflation to go back at the time of our February report. The more solid line is our expectation as to where it goes now. And as you can see, towards the end of this year, food inflation we expect to pick up to about 5%. Now that is an energy story. What's not accounted for in that food inflation story is fertilizer prices, because farmers tend to obviously buy forward fertilizer and store it. So when it comes to them buying fertilizer for the next harvest, that'll start to show through in food prices next year, to the right of this graph. And again, based on kind of the status quo where things are at the moment, Strait still being shut effectively. A lot of fertilizer production comes from the Middle East. About 40% of global fertilizer is produced in the Middle East, a lot of it in Iran, actually. If that doesn't start to open up, then we could see food inflation continue to pick up into next year towards the 6 or 7% mark. If you look to the left, what we're not expecting at the moment is a significant pickup in core goods inflation, nor services inflation. So the dashed lines that you see there are the average, 2012 to 19 average, and then we pick up the graph here. They're above average levels, but we're not expecting a significant pickup in either. Now, the service price inflation is very closely linked to wage inflation, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of graphs in a moment. So how do firms react to higher energy prices? Well, we've got what we call a decision maker panel that we run in conjunction with a couple of universities, UCL and University of Nottingham. And we survey about 7,000 businesses there or thereabouts in the decision maker panel. So since the start of the conflict, we asked those businesses, if energy costs are going to be elevated for a little bit longer, how do you react to that? So some of the striking responses that we got are towards the bottom. So 2/3, about 64%, said that they would look to increase price, which obviously for us is inflationary, obviously, where around about just over 2/3 said that they expected a lower profit margins. Now, the profit margin story, I guess, is concerning to an extent, in the sense that firms' profit margins have been under fairly significant pressure now for a number of years, certainly since the Ukraine invasion, when energy prices, as I've already shown, kind of spiked more. Firms took a real hit on margin at that point, and as a result, they're starting from a lower point, a lower place at the moment. So there's probably less scope to significantly absorb an increase in energy costs, which is why firms will try and pass through in price. However, the unknown around that is how able they're going to be to achieve that price pass through. Again, I mean, this graph is kind of self-explanatory, but the reason that we show it is around consumption. So what this is telling us is that lower income households are more exposed, more susceptible to cost increases from energy costs and the pass-through as a result than higher income households. So this breaks it down into the 10 deciles. And as you can see, if we look at the left, food prices, lower income households spend roughly twice as much of their disposable income on food as higher income households, again, for kind of obvious reasons. Likewise with energy, the poorest households in the economy, around about twice as much of their available income goes on energy than it does for the richest households. For motor fuels, it's a more even story, because for obvious reasons the poorest households are less likely to be car owners, and as a result the kind of hit to their disposable income is less exposed to motor fuel costs. What this means is two things. The obvious is the hit is significant for those lower income households. But what it also means is that the further down the income scale you go, the larger in general your marginal propensity to consume. So you are more likely to consume what you've got in terms of disposable income. So the bigger the hit, the more consumption will be hit. And the more consumption is hit, the more GDP growth is hit with it. So the UK, around about 60% of total GDP is linked to household expenditure, consumption, in one form or another. So the less that households have to consume, the more consumption will fall. So that's fairly significant for us. Now, what I said at the beginning, when we were talking about the key judgments, is that the labour market is much looser than it was the last time we had an energy shock. So if you cast your minds back to 2022, we were just coming out of the pandemic. Labour market was at its historically tight levels, very difficult to find staff, wages were kind of going through the roof. What's happened since that is that the labour market has loosened fairly significantly in recent years. And these three charts here are measurements of that. So the one on the left is the vacancy to unemployment ratio, a key kind of measurement of labour market tightness. How many vacancies are there per unemployed person? And as you can see, post-Ukraine, at that point, there was one vacancy per one unemployed person. As tight as it's been, you could take that graph back another 50 years. That's as tight as it's been. The equilibrium, which is the blue line, is where you would expect it to be at this stage of the economic cycle. And actually, as you can see, the vacancies to unemployment ratio is below equilibrium levels. So the labour market's loosened. The middle one is a key measurement of what we call underemployment. So how many additional hours do people want to be working compared to what they're working at the moment? Again, when the labour market was at its tightest, people actually wanted to be working less hours. Wages had gone up. They were working, extra hours to kind of keep up with demand, if you like. That's fallen, and again, that's fallen below zero. So again, another measurement of labour market loosening. And finally, the one on the right is job-to-job flow. So how many, what percent of employed people are moving between jobs at the minute? There's always a level of that, but again, that's fallen back fairly significantly. So the key takeaway here is, yes, there is an energy price shock, and when we talk about second round effects, what we actually mean is the concern is that if prices do increase, if inflation increases, then workers will bargain for higher wages in order to compensate for that. However, that bargaining power is lessened when the labour market is looser, for obvious reasons. Unemployment picks up. The bargaining strength of those employees becomes less. So that limits the amount of second round effects that might occur. This is a lot of kind of colours going on here, but these are just different measures of wage growth. Again, if you look back to 21, wages were increasing by double digits at the time. Wage growth has come off fairly significantly. So private sector wage growth is around about 4% at the moment. We expect it to continue falling over the course of this year and get down to around about 3.5% by year end. Again, I'll talk through the scenarios in a moment, but that depends on the strength of those second round effects. It is worth saying that most organisations give their wage increases in either January or April. So this year's, for the bulk of organisations, have already happened. And it's very rare that firms will kind of return to that in mid-year and give a further increase. So we've already kind of seen what's happened in 2026. And yeah, that points to around about 3.5% this year, which, for us, again, it's difficult to kind of give it a precise figure, but if we're talking about a 2% inflation target, effectively you want wages to be 3% and kind of no higher than that. So they're pointing in the right direction. We've talked already about firms looking to pass price increases through as a potential, as a result of energy price increases. This graph shows goes back to 2022, and the question is basically to firms, where do you expect prices to be over the course of this year? Firms have told us that they do expect prices to increase by 4.4% this year, as opposed to 3.3% before the invasion. So, we are expecting firms to try and pass those prices through. Wages in orange, I've already kind of covered. Firms are not expecting any significant pickup in wages this year as an effect, of the energy price increase. So watch this space, because I guess the difficulty for firms is, having an intention to pass price through is one thing. Having the ability to do it, given kind of price sensitivity of consumers, might be another thing. So any price increase might be matched by a drop in volume. And demand has been weak now for some time. It might be difficult for firms to pass those price increases through without losing business, without losing volume. So just to summarise key policy judgment 1 before I come on to 2, which is shorter. So we expect those second round effects that I've talked about to be a little bit less pronounced because the labour market's loosened, but we'll keep an eye on that, a very close eye on that. And the longer the conflict goes on without a resolution, the more likely it is that those second round effects will be a bit stronger. So let's come on to the second key policy judgment, which is that we need to balance the costs of not leaning enough against second round effects. So if those price increases, those energy price increases become embedded in pay, then it's important that we don't ignore that. But equally, it's also important that we don't overreact and tighten monetary policy and choke off what little demand we've got in the economy, and that balance is very difficult. So this time round, as I said, we kept rates on hold at 3.75%. Our next decision is it's quite a few weeks away. We went a week early this time because of the local elections, so we've got 7 weeks to see how things pan out before the next decision. Now then, this is going to take a little bit of explanation, so let me just do this bit in a very kind of short term. What the committee considered this time were 3 scenarios, depending on how the conflict played out. So either scenario A is that energy prices follow that market futures curve, which I showed you earlier, over the course of the 3 years that it kind of follows, and in which case second round effects will be quite weak. Scenario B is that energy prices follow the market curve for the next 6 months and then stop, and then it flattens off, which would mean that there would be some second round effects, but not too severe. I'm going to show you this in a graph in a second, by the way. And then there's a scenario C, which I guess is the kind of worst case scenario, is that energy prices continue to pick up and remain elevated for a more prolonged period. And if that were the case, then those second round effects would be more pronounced, and the threat to inflation would be more pronounced with it. So what does that look like? Well, here are the 3 scenarios. So on the left, we've got oil price. So scenario A and scenario B, that these these graphs were drawn up just before the monetary policy report was released last week. So scenario A and scenario B start at the point of where oil prices were at the time, which was about $110 a barrel. As I said, scenario A follows the futures curve. Scenario B follows the futures curve for 6 months and then it flattens off. So in those two scenarios, energy prices will have peaked at 110, there or thereabouts, and finish, in both scenarios, be well below $100 a barrel at the end of this year. Scenario C is a scenario where the Strait doesn't open for a number of months, the conflict has no sign of any resolution, oil supply is constricted, and oil prices pick up to around about $130 a barrel. They're just below 100 this morning, and take longer to come back down. So they end 2026 still above $100 a barrel. Similar for the gas futures. So again, gas prices this morning just above $100. That's 100 pence a therm, not $100. Crikey, we would be in a different situation. 100 pence per therm. Scenario A and scenario B both, draw an expectation that they fall to below 100 by the end of this year, well below 100 actually in scenario A. Scenario C is that they pick up from here because gas supply is choked off, a lot of which comes from the Middle East, and we have a situation where gas prices pick up to above 200 pence a therm and remain at around about 150, between 100 and 150 pence by the end of this year. So hopefully that kind of gives an indication of what those scenarios actually look like. And what would that mean for inflation? Well, under scenario A and scenario B, effectively, inflation would peak at about 3.75% this year, and then would be back to target by beginning of 2027, back to 2% target. And actually, under scenario A, where it follows the futures curve, would be below target over our forecast period. Scenario C is obviously more severe because those oil prices would go higher and stay higher. And under scenario C, inflation peaks at about 6.2% at the beginning of next year, which is obviously way above our target, and wouldn't fall below 2% over the forecast period into 2029. On the right, we have the output gap, which is basically a measurement of the difference between where an economy could be operating at kind of its maximum potential and where it actually is operating. And under every scenario, that output gap widens, so unemployment picks up under every scenario, but under scenario C, that's more pronounced, and the output gap widens fairly significantly into the end of 26 and stays, the economy stays at well below potential, actually under every scenario, but more pronounced under scenario C throughout the forecast period. So again, it's kind of a best case, middle case, which is scenario B, worst case, which is scenario C, and that's kind of where it looks in the economy. Now, what does that mean in terms of interest rates? I'm almost finished, by the way, so I'm kind of ready to come back for questions. Ignore the different colours here, because otherwise I'm going to end up trapped in a really technical explanation of what the Taylor rule looks like and what have you. These are just different measurements of where interest rates could go under different rules that we look at over the three scenarios. Now, what this tells us is at the time of the February report, markets weren't expecting us to increase at all, obviously, over the course of this year, because inflation was coming back to target. In actual fact, markets are expecting one rate cut at the time of the February report. Under scenario A, and scenario B, actually, they're both kind of fairly closely aligned. Markets are now expecting a couple of rate increases over the course of the next 12 months. So average of 55 basis points, so that we go from 3.75 to 4.25. The scenario C, kind of worst case scenario, markets would expect us to increase to 5.25 from where we are at the moment. So almost, another 125 basis points on average increase. So another, between 5 and 6 increases. Now, again, just to stress, that's the worst case scenario where oil reaches 130 and stays well above 100. The good news over the last 24 hours is that oil's come down. However, it's a really volatile situation. So just as an example, when the MPC sat down to vote, the morning of the vote, so kind of 7 o'clock in the morning, oil prices were at about 124. By the time they voted at lunchtime, they were down to 112, I think they were. So that's a really, very volatile situation that you're looking at. And then the final graph, before I do shut up and open up for questions, what we've got to do when we set monetary policy, effectively, it takes time for monetary policy to take effect. So somewhere between 12 and 18 months for an interest rate decision to take effect in the economy. So if we look at some of the direct effects, so what happens, motor fuel prices are passed through almost immediately. Utilities prices on a bit of a lag because of the Ofgem price cap. Nothing we can do in the short term with interest rates for fuel prices, so we look through those. Indirect effects, so how do energy price increases affect a supply chain? Well, I guess it depends. Do producers have fixed energy contracts? Do they do spot? Do they buy forward? So we partially look through those because the effects can take up to 2 years. So those ones we do act on, but we partially look through those. The second round effects, which I've talked about, which is kind of wage bargaining, does inflation get embedded through wage increases? That's the bit we have to tighten policy for, and the severity is, going to depend, what we do with monetary policy going forward. But then, on the other side of that, if, real incomes are hit by higher energy costs and, wage increases coming off, and demand is hit as a result, then we have a secondary demand objective. Then we would need potentially to loosen policy if that were the case. So I've done a lot of talking. Key policy judgment 2, I think I've kind of explained. So basically, it's what we're saying is, there are different scenarios. Depending on how events unfold in the Middle East, we'll react depending on those scenarios. But again, our target is 2% inflation in the medium term, and that's what we're focused on. So I'm going to take a breather and stop sharing. Seeing a couple of hands flash up. So, over to Anna. Do you want to field questions?